public spaces. A program to spread the Bird Bistro message is always part of our World Migratory Bird Day celebration, which is why we're so pleased to have Jennifer Phillips-Vanderberg, Director of the Lake Michigan Bird Observatory, with us today. The Observatory is a nonprofit organization located in Ozaukee County, so thanks for traveling to Algoma today, Jennifer. Jennifer leads the Observatory's Neighborhood Habitat Improvement Project, a program focused on improving bird and pollinator habitat and water quality in lakeside communities like ours. She's here to share how we can make our yards and community more bird, pollinator, and water friendly.
Thanks, Kathy. So folks in the back, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. If at any point you cannot hear me, please raise, if at any point you can't hear me, please raise your hand, especially folks in the back, okay?
We'll raise it and do this.
Yes. I am expecting you guys to participate, at least to help me make sure you can actually hear me. Okay. So as Kathy introduced, I'm Jen Phillips-Vanderberg. I'm from the I have done this too many times in our old name. So previously we used to be the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory. We recently changed our name to the Lake Michigan Bird Observatory. Clearly I'm still getting used to that, but if you've heard of Wiggly Beebo, that's who we used to be, and now we're switching. But our mission is still the same, to protect birds and the habitats they depend on, especially in the Lake Michigan region. To do that, we're trying to address some of the insect and bird declines that we're seeing across our area of Wisconsin, across North America, and much of the world, actually. So we're seeing worldwide declines of insects. This is common both in our area, but we are seeing this on a global scale as well, especially in industrialized areas. And we're seeing also declines in bird populations. This includes really common species, so species like red-winged blackbirds, purple martins, tree swallows are all declining. So a lot of these species that we see every day are still suffering these declines. So something on a large scale is happening. And scientists think the biggest driver of these declines are habitat loss and degradation. But what that looks like is really different in different areas. So a lot of people, when you say habitat loss, you think of rainforest being cut down in the Amazon or boreal forest. But in this region, what it often looks like is something like this. So us changing the landscape in ways that work for us, but don't always work really great for birds. Because in human-modified environments, you typically see a reduction in food base, both seeds and insects for birds. Change in habitat structure, so imagine things like, imagine a forest or a marsh, and then imagine how we live on the landscape. It's a little bit different, so that habitat structure that birds depend on to nest and be successful just isn't there anymore. And also there's increased predation. A lot of this comes from cats, but the other thing is a lot of mammals are really good at living around us and have a higher density in towns than out in natural landscapes. So things like raccoons, crows, possums, even squirrels. So squirrels actually will eat eggs of birds and baby birds. And it's not too hard to see how a lot of ways we create housing for ourselves may not be the most bird friendly. So looking at this, that typical green lawn usually takes a lot of chemicals, so pesticides and fertilizers to keep it that green color. A lot of, this is a subdivision in Port Washington, but it's so uniform, you could be almost anywhere. And then also you see a lot of small trees. A lot of them oftentimes are cultivars of trees, and also a lot of landscaping is not native. All in all, this means it might not be the most friendly for birds. But this doesn't have to be the case. We can create landscapes that don't need pesticides, that don't require fertilizers, and we can that can be aesthetically pleasing and good for birds and insects. And we can do this. And if you're familiar with gardening, you can see that this is actually a mix of natives and ornamental plants. And that's something that we really push for folks with our neighborhood habitat improvement project, is to take one step farther than where you're at. So if right now you have all ornamentals, start with whatever native plant looks beautiful to you. Start with that. And then when you're comfortable with that step, take one more step. And just keep moving as far as you're comfortable, and try to move towards a more bird-friendly yard or spaces in your community. And I think the reason I show this picture is I think it is this is one of our board members' yards. And I think it shows that kind of one step further process. So over the last 7 years or so, she's been transitioning, and you can see clover is now taken over, because once you stop having herbicides, you tend to get other things. And then you can see natives being moved into where between ornamental shrubs and trees. So it's taking where you're at and moving one step forward. And I'll be talking about how we see that process at the observatory, and how you can take that one step in a lot of different ways and still make progress for birds, insects, and insects and water quality. So I'll be kind of grouping these in two chunks: outside your yard, or outside your house, and inside your house, even though a few of these are kind of include both. So then inside your house, I'll be talking about a few things that even if you're not ready to redo your yard, there's still things you can do to help birds and contribute to science. And then, which is the everywhere part, is citizen science is everywhere, and I'll briefly cover some of the really cool projects that are happening in Wisconsin. So let's start with outside your house. This is where we typically spend the most time talking to folks. And the three big things that we talk about are planting native plants. They're I'll get into this more, but they're really, really important for pollinators, and birds eat a lot of insects. So by having pollinators around and hosting, especially moths and butterflies, you're able to support birds that need that insect base in order to be successful. And also they're good for water quality, and I'll talk about how momentarily. Utilizing green infrastructure, this often goes hand in hand with having native plants. So at a home level, this can look like a rain garden, a bioswale, a permeable pavements, lots of different things this can look like, and I'll talk about that. And then reducing chemical usage, and this includes both insecticides and pesticides and fertilizer. So let's start with utilizing natives. So a few things. I just bought my first house 2.5 years ago, and I'll show a couple of the experiments that I've been doing. But things I've realized. I really don't like watering things, and I don't like dragging the hose around. I just don't. That's not a thing I like doing. My husband's a little bit better at it, but I also just don't want to handle it. So what I love about natives is they typically don't need watering once they're established. So I love planting things in the fall, because usually it's wet enough that I never have to water that thing ever again. So you plant in the fall, it's damp, and then it's established by the next spring, and they're ready to go. And that's kind of that's why I love natives from a working with my life standpoint. But the great thing is this also means that they don't need extra water from the tap or from your hose. That means less strain on gray infrastructure, and it also means fewer chemicals, because they're already adapted. They've evolved in our climate, so they're really good at living in it. And they're great for green infrastructure because they typically have deeper roots than ornamental plants. So it actually promotes infiltration of water and slowing down water before it gets into traditional gray infrastructure. And so by traditional gray infrastructure, I'm talking about storm sewers and any kind of retention that's usually around roads and pavement, that ages, and the slower the water you can make the water, the longer it lasts because it's less strain. Like being around pavement means water comes off of pavement really quickly and then gets into wherever it's going, usually some kind of storm system or into our street, and eventually streams or the lake. And slowing it down means there's more filtration and less chemicals. And they are absolutely amazing at supporting birds and pollinators because, again, they evolved in this location and they have these close relationships with pollinators. So everyone's familiar with monarchs. They've evolved specifically just to lay their eggs on milkweed. But that's true of most moths and butterflies. They only lay their eggs on a few species, and if you don't have them, then they can't complete their life cycle. So by having native plants that have these relationships, especially a bunch of our native shrubs and trees are really, really good host species, and I'll talk about which ones are better in a second, but they just have those relationships and they're awesome for it. And then birds eat their seeds, but also those pollinators. So quickly, so why they use less is because they basically have evolved with the pests that we have around here. So they typically will survive being munched on a little bit without having anything like completely kill them. Because that's just part of their life cycle, and that's part of having these around. And so it means you don't need insecticides, usually. And they just don't need much water at all if you plant them in the right space. And they're amazing at dealing with tough sites that we have in everybody's yard. Personally, I have flooding in half of my yard. That's just what happens every spring. But I have a bunch of natives that evolved for spring flooding and then the water going down in the summer. That's just what they do in nature, and that's what they do in my side yard. So these tough sites are often really great for native plants, but shade, there are plenty of forest plants that will do great in shade. Clay, do you guys have clay? Sand? Yeah, around in the lake shore communities, it's either you have sand or you have clay. Those are your only two options, and both of them can be tough on ornamentals. But for each group, there's a whole suite of plants that can live there and thrive. This is in a clay site. They do great in wet, so that's actually a picture. One picture is my house, and the other is a well-established rain garden. They do great in dry sand. Again, the same picture that I started with. This is a few months later once everything is in bloom, and that is the driest sand I've ever seen. Like, that is bone dry, and you're seeing these sand-adapted species just thriving in there, and you can do that with native plants because there's a lot of sand around here and they evolved in it. And another key part of this is that they can't become invasive. So this is garlic mustard, which everyone has probably seen taking over places. And it started out as an ornamental and an herb. And that's where it started from. And that's where burning bush started from. That's where barberry started from. And now those are all rampant in the world, especially in lakeside communities. And they are really destructive. So they suppress native species. They just change entire ecosystems. They can even change, some of the shrubs can change the hydrology of systems. They're just very disruptive to natural systems. And also they just cost so much money. We spend like billions of dollars each year as a country just trying to fight these invasives. And we're losing. So not introducing new species into the landscape and using natives means you can't be introducing invasives. So to keep that from happening, utilizing natives is great, and also slowing the spread of invasives. And you can do that by a few different ways. I used to work for EPA, so I can't help myself but talk about water related invasive species. Most of you probably don't have this in your yards, but I have to make this pitch. make sure you're watching all of anything that comes into contact with water, because our invasive species are really good at having larvae or seeds or cuttings or all of the ways invasive species spread on boats. They're very good at that. Yeah, but that is all kinds of boats, so kayaks to yachts, all of that happens. And be sure to wash them and let them dry. Don't move firewood. We're all familiar with emerald ash borer, but there continues to be new invasive species that are coming up, so just keeping using local firewood is really important. Being responsible hiking, so cleaning your boots and gear, so again, those seeds can stick into your boots. And the other thing that happens to me all the time is my dog loves to get into every burr-filled thing ever. He just does this. He's attracted to it, but we have to comb him out to make sure that he's not spreading seeds either. And then removing invasive species. So for yards, a lot of people don't recognize them for what they are. So learn to recognize the most common invasives and make sure you're getting them out of your yard. So things like garlic mustard just crops up everywhere. I'm trying to think. There are others that I can't think off the top of my head, of course, in front of people, but there are invasives that do well in people's yards, and just being aware, especially with kind of wilder areas of your yard. This is a really wordy definition, and unfortunately I can't figure out a better one. But for folks in the back, green infrastructure, according to the Water Infrastructure Improvement Act, is a range of measures that use plant or soil systems, permeable pavement, or other permeable surfaces or substrates, stormwater harvest and reuse landscaping to store, infiltrate, evapotranspirate stormwater, and reduce flows into sewer systems or surface waters. Okay, so I include this because it really does cover it all, but the important thing to think about with green infrastructure is it's pretty much a way humans can build systems to act more like natural systems. So in natural systems, so imagine water rains on the landscape and it starts to move. So naturally what happens is it starts infiltrating into the ground, it's held up by the roots in the ground, it's evapotranspirated by trees, other leaves, other things that are growing there. Oftentimes it's slowed down again by marshes, and they hold on to water before it slowly is released into water bodies. What happens, that doesn't happen anymore when you have a yard, in cities in general. Just water moves much faster. So even grass can't absorb the same amount of water as trees and shrubs, even native plants, herbaceous plants, absorb more water. And then, so what green infrastructure does is slows down water, allows for infiltration and filtration by plants. And I'll walk through a few examples. So this is kind of your typical yard. So you get runoff either from all different kinds of places, but they're most pronounced off of roofs, off of driveways, off of streets, and things that are just around get caught up in it. So if you're using fertilizers or pesticides or your dog waste, all those things just kind of flow into streams. Because stormwaters or storm sewers outside of Milwaukee and Superior just go straight into water bodies. Like they collect rainwater and then just goes out into the lake or some other stream that's around here. And it tends to pick up trash, detergents, fertilizers, leaves, pest waste, all of those things, and goes straight into ecosystems where it can, especially insecticides and fertilizers, do really bad things in streams and rivers and Lake Michigan. So you don't want that to be going really quickly. The faster it's moving, the more stuff it picks up. So what you want to do is slow it down as much as you can. And on a landscape scale, a really good example of this is using rain gardens. So basically you have a planting that has water holding capacity, so it's a slight divot in the ground that is able to hold some water. And a bunch of things are in there with really deep roots so that it promotes infiltration, and it holds it for just usually for 24 hours to allow it to infiltrate as much as possible and then evaporate. So it's not long enough to allow mosquitoes or anything to hatch in there. It's just long enough to slow down the water and act more like a natural system. And native plants are absolutely awesome for this because they have deeper roots. But there are other ways to do green infrastructure. So rain barrels are another option. This is, it collects water off of your roofs and means that water doesn't have to come from the tap anymore, and that reduces how much water folks have to use. Permeable pavement, so this is actually somebody's driveway. So by having gaps or using kind of bricks or stones that are made for this, they have little gaps in them, and it allows water to infiltrate. This one I show just because it's another rain garden that is kind of, so it's actually like this with a divot behind it too. So what I show for that one is that you can design these things so they look just like beds. They you know what they're doing for functionality, but nobody seeing them will think anything other than that's a native plant bed. And they're really cool ways to design them. I did not do something really cool looking. I just did a normal normal rain garden, but I just like to share that I struggle with all of this too. So that's a picture of my house. The first year we got it in the fall, we planted our first rain garden. So you take out the sod or kill the sod in some way. You create a divot. It's really hard to see the perspective of this with the middle picture because it has an erosion control mat on it so that water, it doesn't pick up the dirt while things are growing in. So because we removed the sod, it was just exposed dirt and we didn't want it to leave. And amended the soil for increased drainage, and then that is it the next spring. So we planted plugs, which are little 3x3s. And the next spring, it was looking like that. By the next spring, it was totally filled in, and it just looks like a native plant bed. There's no space anymore in there, and we're probably going to expand it. But yeah, we have signage on it so that people know what we're doing, especially while it was growing in, because at the beginning, it just looked like that with some little teeny tiny plugs coming up. You can't even tell that there are plugs in there. They're like teeny tiny little guys. So people were wondering what we were doing, cutting up our lawn. This is a fully grown in one. This is one of our partners, a native landscaper, and this is one that she did at the library. And before I go further, I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but the reason a bird observatory talks so much about native plants is the scientific research really backs it up. So we've learned, scientists have learned when I talk about food webs, I talk about even with kids, I walk through, we do owl pellet discussions and go through the food web of what eats what, and they can tell me every single time what will happen if you take away the base of food chains. If I tell them oh yeah, something happened to all of our insects, they know immediately that it won't be good for birds. But scientists have only been really documenting this relationship relatively recently for birds. And a few really great studies have happened, basically looking at kind of traditional yards with a lot of grass and no native plants compared to yards that have a lot of native plants. And they actually found that chickadees raise more young, and they actually have a healthy population when they do that, versus in areas that have no native plants and none of that natural structure that native plants provide, their actually population sinks. So birds will keep coming into and nesting there, but they don't produce enough young to replace themselves. So this is still a really active area of research, but the evidence is piling up that this is really important in urban landscapes for birds. And this all makes sense because say you have a few non-native plants, really low diversity, you will get a few general species of Lepidoptera, so moths and butterflies. But when these parents are out there looking for food, they don't find a lot. And birds can actually modulate how many eggs they lay based on how much food they have, so they can actually reduce the amount of eggs they lay. And they're not able to fledge as many young, either because they aren't able to get enough food or they have fewer eggs. Versus if you have a lot of diversity, a lot of native plants, especially these high value native plants like oak trees and willows and dogwoods, you have a lot of diversity and you can get more of those specialist species, and it just means you have way more things to eat. So when those same birds are out looking for, trying to feed these little voracious monsters that have to be basically fed every 15 minutes. I had a job doing that once, and I don't recommend it for anyone, but it really taught me how much these little guys need to be fed, because pretty much the whole job was just to go around in a circle, and by the time you went around, you'd just be feeding them again. And that was my whole job for a summer. So really understanding that this is true, and I'm amazed that parents are able to do it. But it's really important to have those insects available, because really, even seed-eating birds like chickadees only feed their young insects, and that's pretty common because they have to grow so quickly that it's really hard to do that with seeds. So they pretty much just feed their young insects, and a lot of them, and they need all of that there to be successful. So just to give you a sense of all of these guys that use native plants and insects that live on native plants. Here's a yellow warbler eating some kind of Lepidoptera larva. Here is a kind of the classic goldfinch eating seeds. So those guys love native seeds. Chickadees, again, eating caterpillars, and the familiar robins. A lot of people think they just are with worms, but they also eat pretty much anything, any insect that is easy to catch for them. The other thing that's really important is reducing herbicides and pesticides. A lot of our partners, multiple partners, are folks who do rehab for different animals, but including birds, and they're seeing more and more injuries from pesticides and lethal doses. So this is becoming a real problem for birds, and even if it doesn't kill birds outright, it undermines their food base. So they can kill non-target species like birds, pollute water, kill the food for birds, and can also harm people. So we're learning more and more about how pesticides are carcinogenic. So there have been a few, like Roundup, a few of the more in the news ones, but this is still a very active area of research, but a lot of them share similarities, and there's some concern that this may the list of potentially carcinogenic herbicides and pesticides will grow. What you can do about this is ask, is this chemical necessary? I'm not going to say you should never use chemicals on anything, but I think we need to be cognizant of what we're doing and asking ourselves, what are our goals with our landscape? And if our goals include supporting birds, pollinators, is this chemical really necessary? And asking that of every use, because it's become too common just to blanket everything with insecticides or pre-emergents or all of the chemicals that lawn companies sell, and don't really often analyze what is necessary. And also, so if you have a lawn care company, be sure you're asking that too, because a lot of them don't know. I used to rent, and for some unknown reason, partially because I think it's amazing that any landlord paid for lawn service, not to mow it. We still had to mow it, but they would spray it They would pay his lawn service to come out and spray it, and every single time I tried.
Late 80s, early 90s, he was the 12th patient to get it and the first to live from it.
Yeah, it just lives in certain areas, and it is natural, but yeah, it just happens, and I personally don't know a good solution for that one. Other than it tends to be in very specific locations, so maybe not being in that exact location, yeah, if that's possible. And also, toxic algae blooms and algae blooms in general can cause a ton of economic harm. So, water treatment costs, most water treatment plants are not set up to deal with algae blooms because they were not very common until relatively recently. So most water treatment plants can't handle that. So it's not to say you can't create treatment systems that do, but they're really expensive. So keeping costs of treatment down is important. Decreased tourism. I grew up in that area in the 50s. It was one of the most popular areas to go to the beach. And by the time I was growing up, we moved there in the 90s. And the beach was completely covered with dead algae and stunk to high heaven. So nobody wanted to go there anymore. It's actually doing slightly better now. But it can really do bad things to tourism and decrease property values along wherever it is. So what you can do. Reducing fertilizer pesticide usage is really important. Picking those well-suited species. I personally recommend natives for that, but even if you're looking at ornamentals, pick ones that are well adapted to your conditions because it means you don't need to fertilize them and don't need as many pesticides. Taking care of water bodies, so never put anything near water bodies because unless it's specifically for water bodies. There are some invasive species that you control with chemicals, but leave it to that because just they get into water bodies so easily. And the farther you are away, the more opportunities there are for plants to uptake chemicals or it to be slowed down so that it's not such an acute influx of chemicals. And utilizing green infrastructure helps too. And use these chemicals responsibly, only under ideal conditions. Read the label. You follow instructions very closely and make sure your lawn surface is doing the same. One of my huge pet peeves is when they go around like right before a storm or something and spray everyone's yard, and I just want to like harm someone because it's not doing anyone any good. And it's just washing off into our stream and into Lake Michigan around me. And when an opportunity presents itself, buying organic. It is more expensive, so I understand that's not always possible, but it does support farmers who are reducing chemical usage on a large scale. And dispose of chemicals responsibly. People still put things down storm sewers. Never do it. Never do it. There's just nothing, unless it's pure water, don't put it down there. Because then it just gets into bad places and poisons things, including people. So, hazardous waste collection and medical collection. Unfortunately, I do not know what this area's services are like, but most counties offer at least once a year, or they're supposed to, and contact DNR if they're not, because they should be. That was a pet peeve of mine at EPA. When in doubt, look it up. So there are some things that can go down your households that can be disposed of in households drains, but be sure that it can, because a lot of other chemicals will do bad things either to your treatment system downstream or to mound and septic systems. Like, you don't want to be killing good bacteria in your septic system. You just don't want that. And don't put anything down storm drains. Basically, imagine your storm drain is just going, like, just imagine it being your stream or Lake Michigan, because that's really what's happening, is it just moves right downstream to whatever your closest water body is. So those are kind of the outdoor things that we tend to focus on at the observatory because we're trying to create outside habitats for birds and the ecosystems they depend on. But a few things that are kind of on the edge of it are also really important for birds, but also are ways to take baby steps if you're unable or to change your landscape right now. So things like being window safer, drinking shade cone coffee, reducing plastics, and indoor cats, which I'll briefly talk about each one. So windows are pretty problematic for birds. About 600 million birds die each year from collisions, and these are preventable. Most of them are from relatively low buildings, so buildings like houses and relatively short like office buildings and things like that. As much as we spend a lot of attention on these tall buildings, the majority of them are at houses like yours and mine. So it's something we can all help with. And there are lots of really awesome options now, and I feel like every time I look online, there are more of them. So there's one that probably works for you. So I did this on my house. I did these little dot things, and now I don't even notice them. Like it takes my, I was really worried for like the first 2 days because I was like, it's really trippy to like try to look through the dots, but after 2 days, it's just the window. The window just has dots now. There are pattern decals. They're really variable. You can get anything you want on them. So there's just all different kinds of looks. Physical barriers. So that's another option. So things like leaving your screens on in the winter will actually then they don't see their reflection or think they can go all the way through. So the two ways that birds get into trouble is there are two windows lined up, so they think they can just keep going, or they see a reflection of habitat in one direction, so they think there's still habitat, and their sensory perception isn't great with that. It's one of the interesting things about birds, but also you notice this with kids too. It takes them most kids will walk. When they're younger, have a hard time with sliding glass doors at the beginning. And I watched my nephew go through this stage recently and was like, oh, it's not just birds. I mean, he got in after 2 times, but it was still one of those eye-opening things for me. The other thing that is a really easy DIY option is they're called Acopian bird savers. They're basically paracord that's spaced out about 2 inches, and they're just on a line on the top. You can even use push pins or what is that removable stuff?
Velcro?
Yes, but the removable Velcro.
3M.
Yeah, command strip things. The Velcro ones. You can use that to hold them up if it's under your. It's not as long as it doesn't get too much rain. So you can have them integrate into your into what you're already doing. And even if you're not ready to do your whole house, most of us have heard the noise of a bird collision or seen birds get really close. Pick that window. Try it with one window, see how it goes, and again, taking that one step further.
So let's go on the inside or outside?
Outside. Or the outside ones are much, much more effective. So, there are a couple that are marketed for the inside, but they just aren't as good. They use UV, which all birds can't see, and they just aren't as effective.
All birds can't see.
So really only our songbirds can see UV. So, and falcons. So there are a few other little guys who can. But another thing that is pretty easy to do is shake your own coffee. So what's been amazing, even since I graduated, I've been amazed by how many more stores carry bird-friendly coffee now. So by us, it's a chain in Milwaukee, Sendix carries it, so does Meijer, so does Target. A lot of these big carriers are now carrying bird-friendly coffee, so it's as easy as just picking up coffee from anywhere. And the reason it's so important is that it keeps the overstory trees there while still, so what typically happens in a normal coffee plantation is they just clear cut the whole thing or burn down the whole thing. And so it means that the overstory trees are gone, and then they just plant these bushes that are coffee bushes. So you can see here, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but these are the coffee bushes, and these are the overstory trees. So what this is showing is that retain that canopy while still growing coffee. And it's a much better way for birds and other organisms that depend on it because it maintains that essential structure of a forest, even if it's modified for growing coffee. So it keeps that there and while still supporting birds. So things like scarlet tanagers and multiple orioles that we see all the time around here, when they winter, a lot of them are in really dense coffee growing regions. So in order to protect them, drinking shade-grown coffee is really helpful. And so yes, it maintains winter habitat for a lot of our birds, but also the birds there. And so look for the symbol. It seems like the brand Cafe Fair is the most commonly carried commercial brand at like the larger retailers. But you can also order online. Yeah, a few ways to get it. And reducing plastic pollution is really important for a lot of different systems, but especially aquatic systems. A lot of our aquatic birds get tangled up in macroplastics, so that's what these examples are showing. Birds aren't always great at figuring out what is actually food and what isn't food. So they do eat plastic. They also eat weird other things that they shouldn't eat, like lead shot. So any hunters around here, if you're near water bodies, really don't use lead shot because they eat a lot of it. But using steel or some of the alloys are the alternative. So what you can do at home is choosing plastic alternatives. So things with limited packaging is a good way to start. Metal, ceramic, glass containers, eco-responsible natural fibers. So a lot of things now have certifications on how they're produced, and the fewer chemicals, the better. So things like, obviously plastic-based fibers have the most chemicals because they're made from chemicals, and they keep shedding plastic throughout the entire life of the garment. And again, our water treatment systems are not made to take it out. So it means that these microplastics are getting into the landscape and getting into birds. There even have been found crazily in like penguins that we don't associate as having plastic around, but it actually just moves around the world in weird ways and gets integrated into tissues of things they eat, like fish. But that also happens in the Great Lakes, and we see that happening a lot. And it also gets into people, so that's not awesome. Because our drinking water plants and wells are not made to filter out microplastics. So it just keeps going around in bad ways and can transport other chemicals that are even worse. So, and trying to limit single use as much as possible. So refillable bottles, reusable things, trying to just take one baby step at a time to start trying to carry reusable bottles, take one step, and then see what works in your life. Because it's really, all of this is, which I talk about more when we work in workshops, but the most important thing is that it works for you. Because you're not going to be able to stick with something if it doesn't work in your life. So look at where you can easily change one thing and have it stick, and then take another step. And it's easier once you start building that momentum. Cats, this is sometimes a controversial issue, but they do kill a lot of birds. Also, it's just a hard life for cats. They have about half the lifespan of an indoor cat because it's a hard life for them. But they also are predators. And so what you can do is, especially if you are getting a new cat, keep it indoors. I know it's not always feasible to convert fully outdoor cats to indoor cats during their lifespan, but think about it when you're getting a new cat. And give them lots of enrichment. So a lot of the reason people let them out is that they're antsy or things like that. And there are lots of great tools now to enrich cats' lives. Like I mentioned, I was in an animal behavior program for my PhD, and half of it was on domestic animals and half of it was on wild animals. So I studied wild birds, but a lot of the folks were looking at animal enrichment, so how to make lives better for domestic animals, and it really does a lot to add enrichment to their lives, and it can really take the place of being outside. And then they can have a nice, healthy, long life. So that's kind of the overview. I'm going to very, very briefly talk about what the Lake Michigan Bird Observatory is doing to kind of forward those along. We have, as I've mentioned and Kathy mentioned, we have the Neighborhood Habitat Improvement Project, which is pretty much 2 different studies of change. The first one is we're still collecting data on native plants and how they affect birds, so how can we maximize the benefit for birds? So we're collecting data in a lot of neighborhoods about how to do that. If you're interested in that, please let me know. We're currently expanding up the lakeshore, so let me know. And the second one is to study how we can change people's behavior. So we do a lot of surveys, we try to help people in as tailored an approach as possible. We have workshops, we do a lot of different things to try to help people change and collect data about how successful we were. Some things work and some things don't, and the only way you know a lot of times is to ask people and to try things. So we do a lot of that. So these are just some of the examples. So we have educational programs, a consultation program, basically going out to people's houses to help them to address problems with native plants. And we're also working to make kind of these norms more visible, so putting out native plant gardens everywhere it seems in Fort Washington, but we're moving up the coast starting next year with the plantings. The helping people has already started. But we've done plantings at the YMCA, women's shelters, city parks, low-income housing, apartments, basically anywhere people are and people want native plants, we're working to help them get there and making it more visible so that it seems more approachable to people. Because these plants really aren't scary, but even if some people are a little concerned at the beginning. And that brings me to citizen science, which is the last way folks can contribute. As much as I am biased for birds, there are a lot of other projects that are out there for frogs, pollinators, you name it, there's a citizen science project for it. If you're interested in birds and native plants, I would love to talk to you because we have our own citizen science program. But it's not to say that there aren't plenty of really awesome ones that by contributing to science, you're able to help scientists understand systems better and make better recommendations. And so just a quick review. This is the stuff I talked about. So think about each one of those and which of those is your next step. So what is the next logical thing that you can add to your yard or your house to move one step to being more water, bird, and pollinator friendly? Because ultimately, it's up to you. So hopefully this has given some inspiration or things to think about of what you can do in your own yards and your own community. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. Thanks.
I feed birds over the winter. Are you supposed to keep that up all year round?
You can. It doesn't hurt anything.
But I mean,
But a lot of birds don't switch. Well, there's 2 things going on. One, just more birds eat seeds in the winter, and there are fewer other things to eat in the winter, so you'll get more birds in the winter. In the summer, there's just a lot of other things to eat, and a lot of birds switch to more insects in the summer, so you'll just get them less at your feeder. So it's really a personal preference, but it doesn't hurt the birds to offer it, as long as you keep it very clean. Clean is very important for bird feeders.
You know how you talked about that algae thing?
Yep.
Usually in the summer we have algae flow in our river, and we're wondering how to stop it. So
It's a tough thing. So it depends on where it's coming from. So a lot of times buffers, so planting areas along streams so that there's more area between the source, whatever it is, agriculture or whatever it's coming from, so that you have a bigger buffer so that there's more time for all the plants in that buffer to take up the algae, and the more time they have and the more space basically there, the better it is at absorbing that fertilizer. There are also just different practices that can help, especially with agriculture, depending on how fertilizer is applied. It can change how much potentially can get into streams. But it's a tough one because there are a lot of sources of fertilizers.
Think about Bradford pear trees. I have one in my yard, and it's, birds seem to like to eat the little pears on it, but I've heard it's kind of an invasive.
It is. It's really
debated
big.
cutting it down versus.
I would say you should personally,
Really?
because so when I worked at the Region 5, the Great Lakes office of EPA, so I lived in Illinois while I did that, and they have a huge invasive pear problem. They're just escaping, going places all over the place, and it's just turning into a mess. It's less common in Wisconsin, but it still has the potential. It really has the potential to do that here. So that's my personal opinion. Obviously, everyone has to go with what they're comfortable with. Also, if you're interested in replacements and are willing to come down to Port Washington, we have great deals for replacements, because basically we offer trees and shrubs at wholesale plus delivery fee. So yeah, so it's usually pretty cheap to replace them, or we have some free trees. I think you maybe have still free trees. Kathy was nice enough to distribute some of our leftover trees from Port Washington.
And there is still some left at the
Okay.
end. We've given away quite a few.
Awesome.
But there is still some left at the entrance. You're welcome to pick up as many as you want at this point, because our event's almost over. So, and the instructions for planting are there, thanks to Jen.
And I didn't talk this much about it, but oaks are absolutely amazing for hosting things. They host the most species of any plant that we have in Wisconsin. Over 400 species of Lepidoptera, so our moths and butterflies. They are just powerhouses. And even if we get the complaint that these trees are small, but they're already supporting things when they're small, and you're planning for the future when they'll support even more. But I get the warm fuzzies from knowing that my tiny weird oak trees are supporting Lepidoptera, which I do see on them, and mine is one of those trees, but from 2 years ago, so it's like that now. So I get to watch it go through its the future of these little trees.
Do you have any suggestions for native wildflowers for this kind of like sandy, dry soil?
Landsleaf coreopsis is, actually I should just go back to Jill's yard. Where that one? She has like all of the recommended ones. Actually, I should just look on her list because I can quick tell you. Let's see. Nodding onions should be fine. Butterfly weed is amazing. Landscape coreopsis is great. Multiple mints grow in dry sandy soil. There are multiple asters that are adapted to it too. I'm just using this to sugar my brain. Sweet fern, another great option. If you wanted to take this, I can mark on here which ones I would recommend.
I would appreciate that.
Also, if you wanted, if you shot me an email, I can I can give you to one of our board members who's also a volunteer, but she was the bone dry sand comments, and she has tried both the things that are recommended and not recommended with varied success. Some of them did do totally fine outside of their like preferred soil conditions. Some of them didn't. So it's kind of our trial area versus I have the trial area for deer and hard wet clay. That's my yard. So she has the other extreme of very dry sandy soil. So we joke around that we have the test gardens for the area of seeing what survives. Because if you've ever been to Port Washington, the deer population is ridiculous. They are super tame. You can get within like 10 feet of them and they just don't care. They're the tamest deer. So they eat everything. So if it survives in Port Washington, it will survive any deer anywhere, which we joke around about. And also I have some information about the Lake Mission Bird Observatory, but also just some guides for plants for birds and some other stuff happening. So feel free to pick that up. And if you have any specific questions about your yard or your community or anything, just let me know.
Jennifer, I always say when we know better, we do better. And we can all take simple steps. I hope you enjoyed this event today. Please stop by our table on the way out if you want to. Hi, Mike. If you want to sign up to get our news, you can do that there. We welcome donations. I promise you, if you volunteer with our Bird City Algoma group, it will be a friendly group. Some of us are here today. Raise your hands. Feel free to. That's okay. Future member, we'll sign you up. As we're winding down today, I'd like to thank Sue Hepp for videotaping the programs and give you a chance to talk to Jennifer after this program. Thank you so much for coming today.